It wasn't an algorithm. You need to understand that first. The images and sounds you were shown, the cryptic numbers that appeared in your recommendations, that was a signal, a tuning fork resonating with something already inside of you. You were chosen because you are one of the few who senses that the reality we see is just a fraction of the whole story, a beautiful, hypnotic, but fragmented echo. For months, you've been collecting those echoes, feeling their power without understanding the source. Consider this video the first translation of that source. This is not another theory or a guess. This is the blueprint, the very architecture of the philosophy you've been subconsciously drawn to. What you are about to see is the key that elevates you from a mere spectator of the mystery to an active participant in its unfolding. The puzzle pieces are in your hands. Now, let's begin to assemble them.
There are things that never show themselves at the center. They evade attention not out of shyness or strategy, but because they belong to a different logic, an oblique, yielding logic that escapes the linear architecture of human consciousness. Instead, this presence insinuates itself like a reflection on the curved surface of the mind, like a word overheard from the side, a sensation felt but never localized. Right there, in that suspended zone between attention and distraction, something begins to move. It does not step forward or retreat, but slides sideways, as if reality possessed an active margin, a vibrating fringe that watches you without being seen. Have you ever caught a movement out of the corner of your eye? Something undefined that vanished the moment you tried to look directly at it. It was not an illusion. It was a trace. It is the residue of what your gaze, heavily trained to focus, can no longer contain. There is a threshold beyond which absolute sharpness becomes a kind of arrogance, and clarity turns into a staged performance. Just beyond the edge of your conscious attention begins the domain of another kind of knowing, one that does not seek to arrange the world, but to envelop it, one that does not illuminate, but purposefully blurs. This liminal perception is not a lack of vision, but a portal. It is an imperceptible gateway where reality unfolds in a language not yet spoken, where everything seems suspended in a before or an after, but never quite in a now. And yet, it is precisely in that uncertainty that something reveals itself, not as an apparition, but as a summons. It doesn't show itself, it calls. It doesn't impose, it vibrates. And if you can stay still and receptive enough for a little while, you'll feel it the way you feel a slight draft before the real wind picks up. There is no need to chase. What is needed is to shift the inner posture. To let vision become skin, skin become antenna, attention become not projection, but receptivity. And in doing so, your being will be able to recenter itself away from the Euclidean geometry of dominant thought and begin to live laterally, as if only in the margins could it find a shape suited to its original ambiguity. Because truth, the kind of truth that has not yet put on masks, never appears where you search for it. It circles, it hints, it allows itself to be intuited. And when you think you've caught it, it has already moved a step further, always one step further. We have been taught to trust the light, to believe that what is clear is also true, that transparency equates to honesty, that illumination is always a form of revelation. But every source of light, no matter how pure, casts a shadow, and that shadow is not a side effect. It is an integral part of the design. It is not a flaw, but a structure, an imperfect geometry that protects what cannot be spoken without losing its original force. There's a kind of depth that isn't measured in degrees of clarity, but in levels of blur. The deeper you move into the edges of perception, the more things cease to outline and begin to dissolve. Contours bend. The distinction between figure and background grows porous. In those places, reality refuses to be dissected. It presents itself as a vibrating whole, completely ungraspable, like a dense mass pulsing beneath the crisp image of the world. A mass that speaks far more precisely because it says nothing at all. Within this shadow, every line curves, and every point is an interference. Concepts twist together like gnarled branches, chasing one another without ever perfectly coinciding, brushing past like overlapping waves that eventually pull apart. Knowledge does not advance here in straight lines. It coils around itself in spirals and helices, as if every insight were just the reformulated return of a question you forgot you once asked. When something finally appears at the edge, it never does so entirely. It shows itself as the shadow of something else, as a visual echo, an indirect presence. It does not strike you. You are merely grazed. It does not impose. It encircles. You find yourself knowing without knowing how, recognizing forms you have never seen, but that seem uncannily familiar. This is a layered, lateral memory, one that requires no cognitive scaffolding to activate. It only needs a vibration, a tremor, a barely perceptible discrepancy between what you expected to see and what is actually there. In that hairline misalignment, a passage opens. It is a breach so often overlooked, where reality admits that something is indeed out of place, and precisely for that reason, it is true. Only what cracks can tell a story. Only what trembles can reveal a truth. And only what escapes can point the way. Consider focus not as a tool, but as a trap. There is a barely noticeable deception in focusing intently, a shared illusion so deeply rooted it seems harmless. It is the belief that seeing clearly equals understanding, that whatever stands out sharply against its background must be real, trustworthy, and worth believing in. Yet it is precisely in this excessive definition that the most persuasive falsehood hides. Sharpness blinds, over-clarity scorches, and too much light prevents us from perceiving the very nuances where the deepest truths reside, those that cannot be expressed in words without losing their original resonance. Modern culture has canonized the center, constructing entire systems of meaning around the idea of hard evidence, as if only what falls directly under the eye deserves our attention. And, unfortunately, the human eye selects what the system has taught it to seek. And so, day after day, we lose contact with everything that doesn't rise to the center, that doesn't shout, that doesn't boldly assert itself. Focus traps us not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. It reduces and isolates, turning fluid experience into a static, dissected, and inert object. While we fixate on a single detail, we forget the context. While we define a figure, we lose the motion entirely. But it is within the motion that meaning unfolds, in the relation between things, in the way one presence brushes against another without ever grasping it. That is where the message lives. Every gesture that is too clean is merely a distraction. Every claim that is too confident becomes a wall. Every truth shouted from the middle of the room is, in its sheer dogmatism, already a simplification. Those who truly seek know this. The answers are never under the spotlight, but in the penumbra it creates. They are not on the stage, but behind the curtain, not in the speech, but in the silent pause between sentences. The world constantly offers us polished mirages, high-resolution images, and voices engineered to sound perfectly convincing. But if you learn to look sideways, to slightly shift the focus of your vision, you will start to notice something vibrating out of sync. You will spot something unaligned with the general rhythm, something calling you not to be seen, but to be felt. It is precisely in that dissonance where a more authentic form of knowledge hides, one that is not centralized or coded, but diffused like a faint scent in the air. To see is not to stare, just as to understand is not to dissect. The mind that bites too hard, and the meaning shatters in its jaws. But the mind that grazes, that dances on the periphery, discovers that the universe does not speak in neat answers, but offers itself in silences. When you realize this, the trap dissolves, and then focus is no longer a constraint, but an invitation to unlearn. You should also take into consideration that there are maps that have never been drawn, because the places they represent are simply impossible to outline. They are geographies of the possible, topographies of the indistinct, constellations of interior landscapes that you do not find by walking straight ahead, but by veering ever so slightly off course. These spaces do not emerge under full light. They are intuited at the twilight of attention, where perception begins to unravel and ordinary consciousness gives way to something vaster, less controllable, and ultimately more true. These unspoken maps show no roads, only drifting trajectories. They indicate oscillations rather than directions. They are woven from fine meshes of sensation, hairline changes in emotional temperature, and sudden intuitions that flicker like fireflies. You must follow them slowly, with the kind of attention that does not try to grasp, but allows itself to be enveloped. No two of these maps are alike, because each one writes itself in the exact moment it is traversed, erasing itself the moment you try to define it. In these borderless territories, language ceases to be a tool and returns to being an echo. Words do not assert, they brush past. They do not delineate, but evoke. And you, though accustomed to seeking secure handholds, realize that the only way not to get lost is to stop looking for them. Only by letting yourself be carried by the erratic rhythm of this mental landscape, only by opening yourself completely to disorientation, can you begin to perceive the non-geographic coordinates of a knowledge that cannot be taught. It is passed along through sheer proximity, like static charge jumping between two bodies. Where sentences break without closing, where a discourse veers without warning, where an image does not quite match what it should represent, there, cracks open. Fissures appear. These are access points to a reality that isn't parallel, but exists in certain gaps that aren't somewhere else, but in between. That is where the undelivered messages hide, the glances never returned, the unsaid words that still vibrate like taut strings in the air. You begin to sense that every missed gesture, every sentence left hanging, and every interrupted thought is not an error or omission. It is a structural component of a larger schema in which silence weighs as much as speech, and absence is worth just as much as presence. In this cartography of the unspoken, the only way to find your way is to stop wanting to understand and begin, finally, to listen. When you truly listen, you tap into a lateral memory built entirely on resonance. Not everything you remember has actually happened, and not everything that happened has found a place in your memory. there is a shadowy zone in between, where what you glimpsed only with the corner of your eye settles deep within the mind, continuing to vibrate silently, waiting for the right moment to resurface. These are not clear recollections. They are residual impressions, emotional sediments, and images without contours that move like long shadows inside human consciousness. This lateral memory does not follow chronology. It obeys the far more mysterious logic of resonance. It does not speak in words, but in sudden shifts, irrational attractions, nostalgia for things never lived, and a strange familiarity with places never visited. It is as if experience were not merely an event, but also a wave, and each wave could propagate sideways, crossing time without adhering to its linear logic, depositing traces exactly where no one thought to look. What you brushed against without understanding, what you forgot without meaning to, what you intuited without being able to express, these things continue to live within you like seeds sprouting without permission. And when you least expect it, in a casual gesture, a distracted pause, or a sound repeated by pure chance, these traces reemerge. They arrive not as conventional memories, but as full sensations, deep callings, and flavors you recognize without knowing their origin. Over time, every fragment of reality deposited at the margins of your attention becomes part of this submerged symphony. And if you learn to listen, you discover that every intuition you thought was completely random was actually a response. It was not answering an explicit question, but responding to a deep vibration, a silent oscillation that had long sought your recognition. Resonance isn't repetition. It's a return in an altered form. It is memory becoming present and echo becoming shape. You understand then that what lives at the edge of vision is not a leftover residue, but an origin. It is not a side effect, but a key. And that perhaps, in focusing too far ahead, we've forgotten what calls to us from behind. And ultimately, it is at the edge of your perception that the most revealing message awaits you. There is a point where all directions unravel, where paths no longer lead forward, but dissolve laterally, like trails fading into tall grass without closure. It is precisely at that point that something begins to speak to you. It speaks not with words and not with images. It does not state, and it does not show. It insists. This insistence is not a form of pressure, but a form of presence. And it's a gentle but constant presence, like a background undercurrent you cannot locate, but which, once heard, you can never again unhear. The message that lives at the edges has no fixed shape. It presents itself as an imbalance, a delay, an imperfect coincidence. It might be the way a sentence gets stuck in your mind, the way a glance evades you, or the way a silence stretches out longer than expected. Truth does not hide within the obvious content. It hides in the fold. It waits in that minimal curve separating the obvious from the uncanny, in the soft deviation that derails habit. In that near-nothingness, a passage opens. And if you learn to remain in this state of listening, you begin to notice that the world never speaks to you directly. It always speaks through something else. A distraction, a secondary detail, an apparent mistake. It is precisely in these fissures that the authentic message pulses, as if reality, to avoid being misunderstood, needed to speak in a code meant to be absorbed rather than decoded. Perhaps this is the truth we have always tried to grasp, without realizing that in order to receive it, we had to stop grasping entirely. We simply had to let it happen, the way a dream happens, the way an unexpected melancholy sets in, or the way an intuition with no roots somehow bears immediate fruit. The message at the edges is not read, it is crossed. It is not understood, but recognized, not analyzed, but experienced. When you finally stop searching for a center and let yourself fall freely into the margin, something fundamental shifts. The world is no longer an ordered sequence of events, but a continuous vibration moving beneath the surface, a current of meaning that cannot be damped. Right there, in the blind spot of your vision, you find that the message was always present. It was never there to be resolved, but to keep you moving. It was not meant to explain everything, but to prevent you, at last, from believing there is truly anything to explain. See you in the next episode.